Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
A whole civilization will die tonight. Those are the words of President Trump. And I'm Kailey Leinz. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, coming to you live just 7 hours from the 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline that the president has set for tonight for either Iran to make a deal with the United States or see the destruction by the U.S. military of its critical civilian infrastructure. And it's very unclear at this time where exactly negotiations, if there are still negotiations to be had, stand. We'll get the latest this hour with Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, and analysis from Jeanne Gavito of the Cohen Group, plus our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. We'll also be joined by a perspective from Capitol Hill with Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam joining us shortly. But first, we have to check on the markets as well, which are bracing for whatever may come 8 p.m. Eastern. So with a look of where we stand at 1 p.m., here's Amy Morris here in Washington.
You're absolutely right, Kailey. Stocks are lower. Wall Street is watching what's going to happen next in Iran as we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 down 0.4%. NASDAQ down 0.6%. The Dow down about 0.5%. 10-year Treasury yield at 4.36%. The 2-year yield at 3.86%. WTI is about 2.5% higher at $115 a barrel. Brent crude still holding steady around $110 a barrel. It is little changed on the downside. Bitcoin is down 2.3% at $68,000. And New York Fed President John Williams says his outlook for underlying price pressures in the U.S. is largely unchanged, despite his expectation that higher oil prices stemming from the war in Iran will boost overall inflation. Intel is joining Elon Musk's Terafab project, a chip manufacturing effort for Tesla, SpaceX, and XAI. The project aims to produce a huge amount of computing power each year, and Intel's partnership would help accelerate it. Shares of Intel now nearly 4% higher. Gilead Sciences agreed to buy private German biotech Tubulis in a deal worth up to $5 billion to boost its portfolio in cancer drug development. Shares of Gilead now about 1% lower. And shares of Levi Strauss, little changed ahead of Levi's earnings reports. Those come after the closing bell. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Balance of Power with Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Watching the markets for us as they watch for any development when it comes to the war with Iran and potentially progress toward a ceasefire deal, or at the very least a deal that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, enough to satisfy President Trump so that he will not order the United States military to target Iranian infrastructure, as he suggested he would in a press conference yesterday.
We're giving them till tomorrow, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and after that, they're going to have no bridges, they're going to have no power plants. Every bridge in Iran will be decimated by 12 o'clock tomorrow night, where every power plant in Iran will be out of business. The entire country could be taken out in one night, and that night might be tomorrow night.
And his language has gone from yesterday saying that the entire country can be taken out in one night to today saying on Truth Social, a whole civilization will die tonight. Going on to say, I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. Just how probable is that outcome? Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is joining me now in our Washington, D.C. studio. She, of course, is our Washington correspondent. And Tyler, I'm not going to ask you to have the firm answer to that because, frankly, no one knows. Even the White House press secretary said it's only Donald Trump who knows where things stand on Iran. We're kind of operating in the darkness here.
Right. And there's just been so many headlines that have come out in really the last 3 hours that are informing what is our perception of what could potentially happen here. One thing, though, that appears clear is that this White House isn't backing off of its threat of 8 p.m. Eastern tonight as we see this escalation with the president's rhetoric in this post on Truth Social. I think it may be worth recapping some of the reporting, though, that we've gotten recently. It started with the Wall Street Journal saying that in response to President Trump's post on Truth Social, they were cutting off direct talks when it came to the U.S. Then we got this New York Times reporting indicating that even indirect talks were fully off. But then within the last hour, Axios is now reporting that some progress has been made in the past 24 hours. They haven't confirmed that there's been any severing of ties when it comes to Iran speaking with the U.S., but still their sourcing is saying that it appears like a, quote, long shot that a deal could come together by the president's deadline. And that leaves us a few options on where this could go. As you well know, one means we could see this escalation, which has prompted legal and humanitarian questions in some senses, which experts say will ultimately depend on the size and scope of what actually comes from it. The second is that we could see a ceasefire. President Trump did outline yesterday what needs to be done, most notably the Strait of Hormuz has to happen. And then the third option is maybe we'll get a deferral of the deadline again. President Trump said yesterday that is highly unlikely, but at the same time, he also indicated in this post, quote, who knows what will happen, and said yesterday that he feels like Iran is negotiating in good faith.
Yeah, to your point, this president is no stranger to moving deadlines when it applies to a lot of things, but including this conflict. We've gone from 48 hours, that was 2 weeks ago, to 5 days, then extending it until Monday, April 6th. Now here we are on Tuesday, April 7th. I guess it remains to be seen whether or not this deadline actually sticks. And we don't actually think we'll hear from President Trump publicly today before 8 o'clock, right?
As of now, nothing on the public schedule. We'll be watching for his Truth Social post. We did hear from his vice president, J.D. Vance, speaking earlier today in Hungary, saying that he does feel confident that the U.S. will get some sort of response from Iran, but at this point isn't able to point to what that resolution will look like. As you well know, President Trump said yesterday that Iran's response today is going to dictate whether or not the U.S. is winding down or escalating this conflict. But we've already started to see some of the groundwork being laid today, reporting, of course, that President Trump has been given lists of targets that could meet what you're going to hear a lot of when it comes to questions about targets, this dual use of if a infrastructure target is also used for military purposes like bridges, moving over weapon systems. So that's one part of it, but it's definitely something that is evolving minute by minute.
Well, and as it evolves, we actually are seeing some even Republican voices kind of pushing back on this notion of targeting civilian infrastructure. Yes, it's one thing to have the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world. She's no longer in office. She's a little bit more free to speak freely. But when you have like Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin saying that he is hoping and praying that the president is just essentially, this is just bluster, that he doesn't want to see the targeting of civilian infrastructure. How should we consider the political pressure from inside even the president's own party, Tyler?
Right. That is a significant development, considering that Ron Johnson is considered to be a strategic ally of President Trump's on Capitol Hill, and really marks the first departure from a high-ranking Republican so far when it comes to what was this latest escalation that we ultimately saw today. There's a few different things that could happen here, of course. We're starting to hear a little bit more pressure from Republicans about the timeline of what the conflict could look like. Now, Ron Johnson was responding to this specific threat, but as we talk about how the Pentagon wants additional funding, we got the president's budget request, $1.5 trillion, which doesn't include what we are expecting to be a $200 billion supplemental funding request to be sent over to Congress once the Department of Homeland Security is reopened. That's where you're starting to hear and see maybe that slight pushback occur, that maybe Congress wants to be able to formally authorize military action before they would pair that with an additional appropriations process. And I think that's going to be what to watch for next.
Of course, they're not even here for another week. They're still on recess until the 14th. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, thank you as always for your reporting. And as Tyler told us, we did hear from the Vice President, J.D. Vance, about this earlier today as he was in Hungary on the trail, basically, with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. This is what he said, though, about progress when it comes to Iran.
We feel confident that we can get a response, whether it's positive or negative. We're going to get a response from the Iranians by 8 o'clock tonight. I hope they make the right response, because what we really want is we want a world where oil and gas is flowing freely, where people can afford to heat their homes and cool their homes, where people can afford to transport themselves to work. That's not going to happen if the Iranians are engaged in acts of economic terrorism. So they've got to know we've got tools in our toolkit that we so far haven't decided to use. The President of the United States can decide to use them, and he will decide to use them if the Iranians don't change their course of conduct.
So will that decision be made to use the tools at the American military's disposal? Let's turn now to get some analysis or an opinion on that at the very least. Jeanne Gavito is joining us from the Cohen Group, where she is senior advisor. She's also former acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern affairs under President Biden. Jeanne, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. When you see the words of the president written out on Truth Social this morning, the idea that a whole civilization, this is his words, will die tonight, how seriously do you take that threat?
So I think at the end of the day, threats like that are just simply unhelpful. I certainly hope that the President of the United States, and I don't think he is, threatening, what that statement suggests. I think, it's much more likely that we would see the targeting of the infrastructure targets like has been widely discussed. But these maximalist demands, frankly, from both sides, simply move the parties further and further away from a negotiated solution. And I think what is true today has been true throughout this conflict, and that is that there is no military solution here. If we think that continuing to coerce the Iranians will lead to capitulation, I think we continue to misassess where that regime is. And so deadlines, maximalist demands, I think are fundamentally very unhelpful at this stage.
Well, as you speak of the regime, Jeanne, obviously that first line of the president's Truth Social post is the one that has captured a lot of attention today. But he also said in that same posting, now that we have complete and total regime change where different, smarter, and less radicalized minds prevail, maybe something revolutionary wonderful can happen. Who knows, he says. Have we seen complete and total regime change?
We absolutely have not. If anything, the new supreme leader and the new leadership of Iran is even more ideological and more hardlined than what we started this conflict with. And so, again, I go back to, I think that the administration is not understanding where the Iranian regime is and its resilience and ability to withstand pressure. This regime is evil. And I think many of us share that opinion with the administration. They are not concerned about the well-being of their citizens. And so if we think that they are going to capitulate based on threats against the Iranian people, I think that's, again, fundamentally a misunderstanding. This regime is ideological, and for it, in this moment, survival is the number one concern, and survival does not come through again, in their eyes, capitulation to U.S. demands. There has to be a negotiated solution, whether that happens in the next 12 hours, the next 24 hours, or in the next 2 months. That is the only way that we see this. But no, regime change has not taken place.
Well, so let's dig in more to the potential negotiated solution. We have gotten, to phrase it delicately, mixed messages. Jeanne, I also could say that I am just frankly very confused as to what exactly the status is of negotiations, as we're seeing conflicting reports as to whether or not Iran's even still at the proverbial negotiating table, or at the very least participating in these messages being back and forth. You have the New York Times reporting suggesting that is not the case, that they have walked away. At the very same time, the likes of Axios are saying some progress has been made in the last 24 hours. Typically, with your experience in diplomacy, when things are so hard to understand where exactly we stand, does that actually mean progress is being made, or is that an indication of the absence of that?
So that's a great question. And my suspicion is that actually progress is being made. That may be overly optimistic, but I think that what we are seeing is indication that there is some movement between the two sides. You talk about the proverbial negotiating table. I do not think there is a table that they are sitting at. This is primarily messages being passed back and forth. But I do think what we are seeing is the beginning stage of discussions that will eventually form the foundation to end this conflict. Again, though, at the moment, I think both parties have very maximalist demands. And so those two things can be true at the same time. There can be a willingness to talk or to consider positions and even to compromise eventually. But that compromise may not be enough in the short term.
Well, and we're talking about this, Jeanne, as if there really are just two sides here. But Israel has been a factor this entire time. It has been Israel and the United States acting in tandem, a joint effort when it comes to the attacks on Iran. Do they really have any role to play in diplomacy here? Does it matter what Israel would like to see if Israel has maximalist demands of its own?
So I think the role that Israel has to play here is one of a spoiler. Certainly, as we've been talking about since before the conflict began, this for Prime Minister Netanyahu is a fight that he has been wanting to wage for 2 decades. And the Israeli government's objective in this will be to eliminate the ability of Iran to strike out against Israel. And if this conflict ends today, presumably by some agreement, and today, tomorrow, whatever the time frame is, but presumably by some agreement to get the Strait of Hormuz open. And I think it must be said that a month ago, when this conflict began, the Strait of Hormuz was also open then. But that seems to be one of the key objectives of the administration now. So if the negotiated solution is that the Strait of Hormuz is open and global commerce can get back to normal, and Iran has some assurance that this fight will not be taken to them again, that leaves big questions about the nuclear program in particular. Specifically because we go back to this regime has not changed. And in fact, coming out of this conflict, it is my expectation that the new leadership of Iran will feel more motivated than they ever have before to pursue nuclear weapons. And so if that highly enriched uranium remains inside of Iran's borders and is not addressed through some negotiated solution, then for Israel, that is going to be a very problematic outcome. And so, we could see a scenario, and I think the Iranians will look at Gaza as an example on this. We could see a scenario in which the United States tries to find that off-ramp and comes to some agreement. But for Israel, that doesn't necessarily mean that they stop trying to provoke further, either executing or trying to provoke further conflict.
Well, your point on the nuclear program, Jen, is really important. Are you effectively saying that the U.S. cannot both simultaneously say it has guaranteed Iran will never have a nuclear weapon and guarantee to Iran it will never attack again, at least so long as that enriched uranium remains in Iran's hands?
Yeah, so I go back to the timelines that we're talking about today. 8 o'clock tonight, perhaps, the president agreeing to extend it again in order to allow for the negotiations. If there is going to be a negotiated solution to this conflict, and again, eventually that's what it has to be. There is no military solution here. If there is to be a negotiated solution to this conflict, those macro questions are going to have to come into play. What are you going to do about the highly enriched uranium? What are you going to do about the knowledge that has been gained by the regime in the long term? And I think to address some of those questions, there are going to have to be compromises on the side of the United States as well. What are they willing to offer Iran in exchange for that, potentially in the way of, for example, sanctions relief? And so, if we do see a deal in the near term, again, whether that is today, tomorrow, sometime next week, those questions are not going to be resolved, making it very, very likely that there is a return to conflict, proverbial mowing of the grass, as many would call it, before too long. Something, again, we can't forget that we did this just last June. And so I do think that finding the space for a real diplomatic solution that addresses the wide range of legitimate concerns of the United States, of Israel, but also of Iran, is absolutely essential to a lasting peace.
But Jen, and we just have 30 seconds left here, you don't think a solution that would require that much work can realistically be reached and finalized by 8 p.m. tonight? Absolutely not. And that's where, again, these deadlines that the president continues to throw out are, at the end of the day, I think, counterproductive. Well, and they may not stick, or this one may not. It's been moved 3 times. Could he move it a fourth before 8 p.m.? We'll stay tuned to find out. Jen, thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. Jen Gavito, former diplomat in the Biden administration, now senior advisor at the Cohen Group, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. And we'll have more analysis coming up with our political panel. So stay with us right here on Bloomberg. Bag fees going up along with the price of oil and a gallon of gas here at home. The AAA average now at $4.14 a gallon on average across the country. Speaks to the economic consequences already of the war with Iran. And we're all facing the question today as to whether or not that war is poised to escalate even further as we approach rapidly an 8 p.m. deadline tonight set by President Trump for Iran to either make a deal and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or to face the destruction of its critical civilian infrastructure. And of course, the president has taken to Truth Social this morning. You've heard me say it multiple times here on Balance of Power already today. He said, and I quote, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." The question is to what extent we take his words literally and whether or not he is actually serious about this threat, or we could see this deadline move once more. Whatever you're reading of it, it certainly has sparked reaction on both sides of the aisle. Perhaps not surprisingly, you are getting strong responses from Democrats, dozens of whom have now called for the invocation of the 25th Amendment over this post and this language from the president. But it's not just Democrats as well. A former ally of President Trump, former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, has also taken to Twitter today to talk about invoking the 25th Amendment over this threat from the president. And even elected Republicans like Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin are now pushing back on the language. He said in a podcast that he's hoping and praying that Trump's statement are bluster. He says, and I quote, "I do not want to see us start blowing up civilian infrastructure. I don't want to see that. We are not at war with the Iranian people. We are trying to liberate them." The question is, could other voices of Republican senators or Republican representatives join Senator Johnson? And to that point, we turn now to our political panel. Republican strategist and Stonecourt Capital partner and Bloomberg politics contributor Rick Davis is with us alongside Jeanne Zaino, Democratic analyst, also a politics contributor for us here at Bloomberg, and democracy visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Jeanne, when we consider the words of Ron Johnson, that is the one that at least made me widen my eyes the most today. The others who have been critical of this language from President Trump are really not coming from surprising corners. But if you have one Republican senator, are you about to have many who are echoing that same kind of sentiment?
I hope so. You know, since they're on vacation, or I shouldn't say vacation, since they're out of Washington, it's harder. They're not being sort of pinned down, as you will, by the press who would be able to ask them their response. So I think they're all grateful they're not in D.C. today. But I do think this rhetoric is so over the top that I hope a dam has broken and that Ron Johnson is leading the way, because I think beyond the question of whether we take them literally or whether this is bluster, is this who we are as Americans, that the U.S. president is getting up the morning after Easter Monday and saying he is going to destroy an entire civilization? That is a threat of genocide, and that is not who we should be as Americans. By the way, Kailey, on the 250th anniversary of the United States. So I hope that many other Republicans and Democrats and all Americans join in condemning this kind of rhetoric.
Rick, do you anticipate a breaking of the dam, as Jeanne phrased it here?
You know, it's hard to see a dam breaking, but I think on the edges of the party, there's a lot of discontent on this. Other members like Senator Tillis, who has been a critic of the president and is not running for re-election, you know, has been talking about the lack of direction, objectives, and discipline of this war effort. So, yeah, and you have to point out Tucker Carlson, who has millions of followers, has unleashed a real big pushback against Donald Trump's language, exactly what you were describing. So it's coming from a lot of different quarters. But when you look at the survey data, the people who are supporting Donald Trump in this war effort, regardless of what he says every day, are the base of his supporters. When you look at the GOP, still getting 90% of support of those voters, behind him. So you don't see the cracks in any political point of view, but certainly from the leadership of his party and others, there are people who are looking for a safer place to occupy. Look, the hot rhetoric is a brand of Donald Trump's. He says the most outrageous things, and it is for effect. And we can be concerned about the things he says, because sometimes it is followed up by action, but many times it's not. And so, we hope in this case that it's not a literal translation of what the president's saying, and maybe it's a negotiating tactic, but we'll not know. And it is abhorrent kind of language. It shouldn't be used by a president of the United States. So that's a place we can be and be confident that we're more right than wrong. But look, I mean, right now the party's holding with him. But when you look at independent voters, they've bailed, right? They don't like this war. They don't like his conduct. And, by the most significant number I've ever seen, independent voters are saying, don't count on us to be supporters of Donald Trump.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel and Bloomberg politics contributors, thank you so much. And Rick, ending on the point that a lot of this is going to come down to how voters interpret the words and decision-making of this president, as there could be political consequences to this war with Iran, as there could be economic consequences. We already are seeing them in the translation of high gas prices, even higher bag fees as airlines try to offset some of the higher fuel costs that they are facing. It all could be a factor as we head into the midterm elections in November. Of course, that's still 7 months away. A lot could change between now and then, and there's a lot more time still between now and the 2028 general election when we'll be electing a new president. But that hasn't stopped 28 contenders or potential contenders from weighing in on this conflict, like California Governor Gavin Newsom, for example, who has been quite prolific on social media, calling the war with Iran an illegal one and highlighting the economic consequences of it. And it's the economic consequences in Newsom's home state of California I would like to spend a moment on as we talk about high gas prices across the country. The average right now in California, according to AAA, is $5.93 a gallon. Incredible numbers that we're considering. But considering the California economy overall, the picture may actually look pretty good. That's the subject of a new Bloomberg opinion column written by Bloomberg editor-in-chief emeritus Matt Winkler, who is joining me now. Matt, you actually had the chance to speak with Governor Newsom, and thanks for joining us to talk about your conversation. You write in this piece, of all the prevailing media narratives around Gavin Newsom, the one that is most conspicuous by its absence is how under its two-term governor, California became the top-performing economy, not just among its 49 siblings, but also any developed nation. Walk us through the figures you're looking at.
You bet. Starts with gross domestic product. Since he took office in 2019, GDP surged 40% to more than $4 trillion. That accounts for more than 14% by the way of U.S. output. And the second largest economy, China, by comparison, expanded 32%, Germany 16%, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. So anywhere you look in the developed world, really anywhere in the world, California, measured just by GDP, is the outstanding performer. But it gets even more overwhelming after that. Within the U.S., you can see, based on the so-called Philadelphia Fed indices, that California overtook the U.S. in terms of growth, but overall performance of the economy, because the Philly Fed data measures not just GDP output, but it measures a whole bunch of things and also takes into account inflation and employment and all the things that we look at. When you look at the relative value of California in the equity market worldwide, technology stands out. It's the best performer in global equity. And as the best performer, California dominates technology with returns that are just stunning, 600% in the period. And when you look at healthcare, again, the industry's contribution to California GDP increased 52% since 2019. And that includes 25 last year, a year when President Trump and the congressional Republicans enacted major cuts to Medicaid and reduced the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits, which is estimated to put 15 million people losing their health coverage. And that's not an accident. California's uninsured rate declined to a record low 6.4% in 23, and that's the largest drop in the U.S. from more than 17% a decade ago. It was helped by legislation that Newsom had something to do with, called Covered California and Medi-Cal. Then you look at venture capital. The prevailing narrative has been that people are leaving California, that the high taxes, the regulation have made, if you like, capitalism go elsewhere. Actually, the opposite is true. California startups raised 62% of all venture capital dollars in 2025. And if you looked at, the VC business itself, California continues to dominate. The next closest states would be New York, Massachusetts, and Texas. And California is way up there, 31, 32%, and they're below 6%. So the bottom line is just California is overwhelming. But it's every market you look at. I could go on, but just every metric.
I wish we had
see on the Bloomberg.
I wish we had time, Matt, for every metric, and we'll have our listeners and viewers check out the Bloomberg terminal to see for themselves. But in our final moment here, how much could a Governor Newsom in California apply this nationwide if he wants to be a President Newsom? How easy is that translation?
Well, actually, again, the media missed it. Biden was the most progressive president in terms of what government did for people. Whether it's creating jobs in Georgia that never existed before, manufacturing, raising semiconductor salaries in Arizona. That was all done through legislation. The unemployment rate in Scranton, Pennsylvania, record low in 24 of 3%. Biden did that, and Newsom was his biggest supporter.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. Matt Winkler, Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief Emeritus, thank you so much. And you can find Matt's column, Who Knew Newsom Was Such an Economic Maestro, on the terminal and online. We'll be back with more Balance of Power next on Bloomberg. Thank you all for being here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio on this Tuesday edition of Balance of Power, which also happens to be a deadline day edition, as it is 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight that President Trump has said is the deadline for Iran to either reach a diplomatic negotiated agreement with the United States to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and get to a ceasefire in this conflict, or to see the U.S. military targeting critical civilian infrastructure like power plants, for example, if no deal is reached. And it's anyone's guess, frankly, at this point, as to whether or not he is going to go forward with that plan, if a deal will be reached, or if we could see once again a punting of the deadline to another day. And the president himself admitted yesterday in a briefing with reporters that he isn't sure what happens next.
And we've heard a range of those kind of messages. So which is it? Are you winding this down, or are you escalating it?
I can't tell you. I don't know. I can't tell you. Depends what they do. This is a critical period. They have a period of, till tomorrow at 8 o'clock.
So let's see where things stand as of 1:43 p.m. as we turn to Iain Marlow, who is a national security editor for us here at Bloomberg and is with me in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Iain, I've seen some mixed reporting from various outlets. What is the latest that Bloomberg knows at this point as to whether or not there is still diplomacy or diplomatic efforts happening and whether or not they are progressing?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of maximum threats talks going well, the same kind of messaging that we've heard for a while now. And it's interesting because the threats keep getting more serious. We have a lot of people now just openly musing about whether the U.S. president is openly pledging to commit war crimes after the 8 p.m. deadline with attacks on civilian infrastructure. And the threats, the attacks keep getting more severe. And yet Iran is refusing to bend here. You do have a fairly hardline regime, has seen a lot of its top leaders assassinated and bombed as part of this conflict. And I'm not 100% sure that threats of taking out bridges and other things like power plants is the thing to finally do this. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what things kind of, if we have an accelerated set of negotiations leading up to the deadline tonight. But so far, there's been lots of mixed reporting, but we haven't heard much about serious talks or getting close to a deal and then just finagling the details. It really does seem that we're at two very polar opposite extremes here.
Well, and so that raises the question of how much room there is in the gray area, Iain. If it would be enough simply for there to be a step forward made, enough that President Trump decides, okay, I will push this deadline once again, having already done so 3 times, from 48 hours to 5 days to April 6th to now today. Yeah,
exactly. We could definitely see another 2-week, time frame. His famous phrase for things he likes to kick down the road. It's really unclear at the moment what we're going to see. There's any number of things where he could say, okay, Iran promised to let a few ships through, or they promised to, they're showing progress here. There's any number of things that Trump could say publicly that would allow him to let the deadline slip once again. It's clear that since since this conflict started, when the U.S. and Israel opened this war, there's been a lot of American munitions dropped on Iran, a lot of targets destroyed. The Pentagon keeps telling us, thousands and thousands, and yet the regime is still not bending. And over the weekend, we did see this the U.S. warplane shot down. So it's not. Yeah. This is not a risk-free enterprise. And I think up until now, the president and his military advisors have pursued what seem to be risk-free options. A very quick raid into Venezuela, bombing places like Nigeria or Syria. Places that can't really shoot back in some ways. And now we're in a really protracted situation that it's very clear Trump wants to end. It's not very often you have, the world's mightiest military sort of repeatedly asking over and over again for a country to agree to sort of end the war. I mean, that it's not generally how wars are fought. You make them surrender by, militarily defeating them, and we're not seeing that right now. So we're seeing this kind of strange asymmetric fight between Iran and the U.S., and it all comes back to Hormuz and this extremely valuable waterway. And to be honest, Iran is closing it with threats. They're saying they'll hit these ships. They've hit a few ships in the region. And a lot of energy facilities. But it's really that risk factor that is closing the strait and driving the U.S. response. And Iran, in many ways, even though they've been pummeled, they've seen their leaders killed, it's hard not to see them, having a little bit of the upper hand here in the sense of they're sitting back, closing Hormuz, and saying to the U.S., the ball's in your court.
All right, Iain Marlow, national security editor for us here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much. And as Iain speaks of the threats from Iran when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, of course, as we've been discussing today, President Trump is making threats of his own on Truth Social ahead of this 8 p.m. deadline, writing, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." He says, "I don't want that to happen, but it probably will." And this language is now calling for dozens of elected Democrats in both the House and the Senate to call for the 25th Amendment to be invoked. And we're joined by a Democratic representative now. Congressman Suhas Subramanyam, representing Virginia's 10th District, is here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, I appreciate your time. Would you join your colleagues in making this call for the 25th Amendment?
Yeah, I mean, the president right now is showing that he's not fit to serve in this at this level. I mean, what you want from a president right now is someone who will show steady leadership during a time of war, that they will be reasoned in their actions, that they will work collaboratively with Congress to make sure that our troops are safe. And instead, what you have is a president who's throwing out outrageous threats, threatening war crimes, and legislating by Truth Social. And it is frightening people. I mean, I have so many people calling my office today just frightened that World War III is about to begin. And so this is not the type of leadership we need right now. The 25th Amendment needs to be instigated by the cabinet. But in the end, I mean, the president right now is just showing us that, he is not the right person to be leading our country right now.
Well, and as you speak of war crimes, we should note that you're ranking member on the Oversight Subcommittee on Military and Foreign Affairs. If the president were to actually follow through with what he's threatened, would you demand a congressional investigation into that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He absolutely needs to be investigated. The decision makers and the people who executed it, everyone needs to be investigated if they target civilians. Remember, we still haven't gotten any real proof that there was an imminent threat to our country. So this was a war of choice. And it's one thing to hit military targets and try to weaken their ballistic missile program or their nuclear program. It's another thing to deliberately hit civilians and civilian targets and say that and project that to the world. We lose our leadership in the world stage. We lose our moral high ground in the world stage. We're already losing on a lot of those things. And the president, by saying these things, is just showing, again, that he's not fit to be leading us right now.
Well, of course, the president just last week requested of you and your colleagues approval of a $1.5 trillion defense budget. And that's before he even makes, and the Pentagon formally makes a supplemental funding request of some $200 billion, as we expect. Congressman, I wonder if you see this fight potentially over that supplemental funding in particular as being the best avenue if there is to be congressional pushback to the president's efforts, because we all know the way that war powers resolutions votes have gone down thus far. But could supplemental funding be a different story?
First, I would say if we had another war powers resolution, I would expect some Republicans in the House to join us, and for it to at least pass the House. The president may be able to veto it and stop it, but I think it's important to show that the House, including some Republicans, do not approve of this war at this point. Second is the president said that this war would only last 4 to 6 weeks, and that we were already successful. It's already mission accomplished. So why does he need hundreds of billions of dollars more, trillions of dollars more? And in order to pay for this war, he wants to essentially steal from the American people's healthcare, education, childcare, all these programs that help Americans and put America first. Instead, what he's doing is he's doing exactly what he said he wouldn't do the last several years, which is start another war and pay for it by taking from the American people. And so he will not get a dime from me. And I'm sure many of my colleagues would join me in that.
Well, I guess we'll have to see when a vote on any kind of supplemental funding or another war powers resolution will reach the floor, as you and your colleagues do still remain in recess for the next week. And I wonder, too, Congressman, what you're expecting upon return from recess when it comes to funding for the Department of Homeland Security, ICE and CBP. Is it your expectation that you will get the chance immediately to vote on the Senate-passed bill, as we're seeing reports that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, wants to see more progress on reconciliation that would fund the other parts, CBP and ICE specifically, first? What is your anticipation? What are you hearing from your leadership?
Well, we should have voted on the Senate plan last week, and even the administration now is getting behind it. And so they should call us in today. We should vote on it today, and we will end the shutdown today if Mike Johnson chooses to do so. But House Republicans are the only thing standing in the way of ending this DHS shutdown. What I expect to happen is we will come back next week, and we may need to take another week or two to figure out what House Republicans want to do to please the most extreme people in their caucus and get some funding that they apparently need for ICE, even though it has billions of dollars already, $43 billion. It's already funded for 8 years now, right? So it is really unfortunate that House Republicans have put us in this situation, but this should be over by now, and I hope it's over by next week.
But if and when it ends, when it is finally over, Congressman, have Democrats lost their opportunity to exercise any leverage over actually getting reforms to ICE and CBP?
Well, if they put ICE funding through the reconciliation process where they don't need 60 votes in the Senate, they are establishing a new precedent for putting funding bills through this reconciliation process, to budget bills through this reconciliation process in a way that is unprecedented. And so I would love to see them come together with us and be collaborative. I believe that there are Republicans who believe in civil liberties and want reforms to ICE and don't want American citizens shot. But if that's not the case and they do go that route, they're creating a new precedent.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate you joining us. Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam, representing Virginia's 10th District, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio, giving us a view from Capitol Hill on not just funding for the Department of Homeland Security, but of course the threats from President Trump on Iranian infrastructure, civilian infrastructure at that, if no deal is reached by 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight. You just heard from the congressman who's the ranking member on the Oversight Subcommittee on Military and Foreign Affairs that he believes that would constitute a war crime. President Trump told reporters yesterday he's not worried about that. And of course, we still have a question as to whether or not he will follow through at all, or if this 8 p.m. deadline can move again if there's progress in negotiations, which right now remains very unclear. So that's where we stand at nearly 2 p.m. Eastern time. I'll see you back at 5 p.m. Eastern time with the latest on Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.